So the first reading is from Exodus chapter 34, verses 5 to 10. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. Moses bowed to the ground at once and worshipped. Lord, he said, if I have found favour in your eyes, then let the Lord go with us. Although this is a stiff-necked people, forgive our wickedness and our sin, and take us as your inheritance. Then the Lord said, I am making a covenant with you. Before all your people, I will do wonders never before done in any nation in all the world. The people you live among will see how awesome is the work that I, the Lord, will do for you. The second reading is from Luke chapter 15, verses 11 to 32. Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. And so he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had and set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and to celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the elder son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother has come, he replied, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. The elder brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you, and you never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. My son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.
So those of you that were here last week might remember that we talked about the real God that is knowable. Today we're going to explore what it is to know a real God who is constant in character, especially in line with our vision statement that's going to appear on the screen in just a moment. That is, to be real people living with a real God, asking real questions. So we've got a few more services where we're going to be focusing on this real God that we believe in, that we want to live alongside. We're living alongside today a God who is constant in character. And as we explored earlier when we were playing the traitors, it's hard to trust someone whose character keeps changing, isn't it? Is it? In the same way, it would be hard to have faith in a God who kept being different. How could we come to know who he really is if his character wasn't constant? So to give you another example of where we might be trying to get to know someone, where we might be trying to work out whether or not we can trust someone, I'm not going to go down the lines of Emma Watson like I did last week, but I am going to talk instead this week about dating and courting. When we date someone, we do it with the intention of getting to know who they are, don't we? Yes? We want to know whether they can be trusted and whether we want to trust them with the whole of our lives, with everything that we have ahead of us. So we don't tend to just date someone once and then decide to get married, do we? There are some people who get married rather quickly, but we tend to make sure that we have at least got to know someone a little bit. And the idea and the encouragement for a long time has been to, what was the phrase somebody told me once? You've got to year-round them. You've got to spend at least a year with them to see what they're like in each of the different seasons. Because you want to know what they're like. You don't want to marry someone who pretends to be something when you're together, and then when you actually end up being together all of the time, you find out that they're completely different. And so too, do we want to make sure that the God that we're believing in, that we're worshipping, is as constant in their character as we think they are, as we think we know they are. And you are going to find out a little bit later on that as the church has been believing in God for so long, as the people of God have been believing in God over the centuries, that they have found God to be just the same as he was for those that came before him. And that continues even today. So our first reading from Exodus pretty much followed on from last week too. After Moses descended the mountain and reprimanded the Israelites for making their golden calf and going into the tent of meeting, and he is invited by God to climb back up the mountain with 2 new slabs of stone to replace the ones he broke. And as he does so, the Lord pronounces his name. The Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of their parents to the 3rd and 4th generation. You might find it helpful, folks, if you have a Bible or in your hands or with you or on your phones, to open up to Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7. You might find it helpful. You might be all right. But I offer it now to you to give you a chance to find the right page. First thing to notice here is that the Lord reveals his name, which is, as I said last week, incredibly significant because the name of the Lord back then was unknowable. In fact, it's still, in theory, unknowable and unspeakable. So this is God revealing himself to Moses, making himself knowable, as we discussed last week. But beyond going and sharing his name, God goes and does something else. He describes his character. And how does he describe it? Well, with these 5 words. And another PowerPoint is going to arrive. And we've got compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. Wow. Does that sound like somebody you want to worship? Yeah. Like somebody you want to get to know? Like someone you want on your side? Does it sound like a great friend? I won't quite go as far as a good date, but I reckon probably. God describes himself as compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. But then what follows might cause some of us to go, Because I don't know about you, I'm remembering those words about punishing the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. So what's going on in that part of those verses? Well, really, it's an exploration of how this applies and is an example in the face of the rebellious Israelites, if you will. Moses has asked God if he will be faithful to his promise to Abraham and bring about salvation through this family. And God responds that I will maintain my love for thousands by forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. But then, lest the Israelites think that this mercy is a free ticket to do whatever they want, God balances this out by declaring his heart for justice too. He will not leave the guilty unpunished, but will punish their children and their children for sin of their parents to the third and fourth generation, who repeat their ancestors' rebellion against God. They'll get what they deserve. But I do invite you to notice, you can leave that up if you like, do invite you to notice the contrasts between the third and fourth generation to the thousands of generations at the top of that slide there. God will maintain his love to thousands of generations, but he will remember sin only for 3 or 4. God's forgiveness is massive. God's anger and heart for justice knows that it cannot go on hating people forever, but that it must give new chances, new opportunities. But that also doesn't mean that he's just going to let them off. There are consequences to our sin, and those often take a little while to work out and to understand. Look too at the passage, and you will see that God's forgiveness of sin in the first half of his example is contrasted with God's justice on sin in the second half. God will forgive sin, but also not let it slide. He will not declare innocent the guilty. God will seek justice, but he will do so with compassion and graciousness and be slow to anger. He will abound in love and faithfulness as he seeks that justice. And actually, there's a bit of tension, isn't there? There is a tension that exists between God not declaring innocent the guilty, but also being a God who is slow to anger. God is living in this moment with Moses right here and now in that tension between his character, who he is, of being slow to get angry, but also the fact that he wants these people to be faithful to him, faithful to their own word, to the things they've promised. And how does God live within that tension? But with compassion and loyal love, with grace and faithfulness. He remembers his promise to Abraham and continues to work it out. And sadly, this isn't just the first time that God has to live within that tension, with that question of how does he remain faithful and loyal in the face of such rebellious people. That same tension that God has to live with within himself continues throughout the whole biblical narrative, and I would argue still today. How does God remain faithful to who he is, to the words that he has promised to those who have gone before us in the face of our sin and our unfaithfulness? He will do it by remaining faithful to his words, by remembering those promises, by seeking to forgive, by offering his grace, by being slow to anger and showing patience and showing compassion. You might well ask, why am I spending so long on the Exodus passage today? Because, let's face it, the prodigal son is a much nicer story. You've heard it before, it's familiar, and we like it, and we know that it is a heartwarming story, and we will come on to it. But we're sitting with the Exodus passage because it doesn't just exist in Exodus. Those characteristics of God that you remember that appeared on the screen just now, and will maybe appear again in a moment, exist throughout Scripture. Take a look at Numbers 14, verse 18. And Moses quotes it back to God when pleading for Israel about their rebellion. Oh, look, rebellion again. Nehemiah, in confession with the Levites, records God as gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love in Nehemiah 9:17. It appears in Psalm 86 and Psalm 103, even 145. The Lord is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. In Joel 2:13, return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and relents from punishing. Jonah 4:2 sees Jonah complain that God is a gracious God and merciful, who's slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. Because it means, because God is that he's going to go and declare the Ninevites that they are terrible. And then God's going to forgive them anyway, because that is who God is. Nahum 1:3, the Lord is slow to anger, but great in power. 2 Chronicles 30, verse 9. For the Lord your God is gracious and merciful, and will not turn away his face from you if you return to him. You might see some parallels in Lamentations 3, verses 32 and 33, and Micah 7:18-20. And it doesn't just stop at the Old Testament. These characteristics inspire a lot of the writings in the New Testament too. In Luke 6:36, we hear, be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Romans 2:4, Romans 9:15 all show echoes too. There's echoes in Ephesians and 2 Peter and James. And if you go looking harder, you can probably find even more than me. Because for centuries, these words, these characteristics have been known about who God is. God is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. And that is good news for us. That is good news for us because we can trust God to be all of those things. When we mess up, when we screw up, we can come and remind God that he's compassionate and gracious, that he has love for us, and that he will be faithful to us. But it also means that if we're ever trying to listen to God, and we think we hear something, but we're not quite sure whether it's God or not, we have something to measure it by. Has anyone ever been in that position where they've felt a little nudge, where they've had a little feeling or a thought pop into their brain and they've not been quite sure whether it's God or not? Anyone else had that? Yeah. Well, how about asking yourself, next time it happens, is this something that a compassionate God would say? Is it something that the gracious God would ask of me? Is this something of a God who's slow to anger, or is this me getting frustrated at a particular problem? Does this come from a God who abounds in love, not just for me, but for all people? And does this seem like it's from the faithful God, faithful to us all? Does it feel like there's something of God's desire here for justice? And I add justice because, as I showed earlier, in the example that we receive, that is really what God is living in that tension of. I want things to be right. I want things to be well and good for all people, particularly for the Israelites, but I also need them to know when they've got it wrong. Justice is at the heart of these. But also, pretty much every time these words are mentioned in the Old Testament, they're mentioned at a time when people are throwing themselves on the mercy of God in the face of their own sin, in the face of their own wrongdoing. It's almost as if we only ever really remember who God is when we really need him, when we know we've screwed up really badly and we can't find a way out on our own. It's almost as if we only remember these words when we need his compassion and forgiveness. But look, too, these words are great at describing God the Father, but we claim too, do we not, that Jesus is God? Do we make that claim? We do. So I'm going to invite you now just to take a look at his ministry, and as much as you can remember or know about Jesus' ministry, and ask if you can see an interest in justice. Someone who is slow to anger, compassionate and gracious, abounding in love and faithfulness. Do those words apply to the Jesus that you know, as much as you know him? I'm seeing some nods. I'll take that as encouragement. I'm certainly only aware of one real instance when Jesus gets properly angry. And that wasn't long before he died, so it certainly took him a long time to get there, 33 years or so. I'm pretty sure that the compassion, love, and grace abound so much that I barely need to mention them. But I think I do want to point out today about Christ's faithfulness, because it really is amazing. I'm thinking in particular of that prayer that he prays in the Garden of Gethsemane. Not my will, but yours be done. There's something about it at the moment that's just hitting hard. That willingness to serve the Father all the way to death. It's almost awe-inspiring, isn't it? Just, wow. The bravery, the courage, the commitment in that prayer. To give oneself over to someone who is compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. I don't often like using the phrase greater good because it gets abused. But to give oneself over for God's will and God's desire for the whole world. Scary. And yet just last night we were remembering the courage of others who have done the same up at the bonfire celebration in East Grinstead. Because that in itself is an act of remembering those who have sacrificed themselves, who have given of their lives that others might know that they are loved and loved enough that people want them to live in peace. So let's finally get round to the prodigal son. I think it serves two purposes in our service today. Firstly, a reminder of the character of God. The character of God that has been shown time and time again. Look at the parallels with me for a moment. In Exodus, God reveals his name to Moses. In the parable, the Father reveals his heart. In Exodus, God forgave the rebellion of Israel. In the story of Jesus, the Father welcomes the rebellious son. In Exodus, God reinstates his covenant with the family of Abraham. And as the son is welcomed home, there too is family reconciliation. More than a reminder, though, of the character of God, of just who God is, is this parable of Jesus is also one that declares the moment of restoration that is arriving. Through Christ's gospel message, people have begun to return to God. And God is celebrating, throwing a party, except others aren't quite sure that that's right or that it's really God. For the Pharisees and others expect God to work out their hopes as they imagined. So they might not be able to accept that God is doing something, that God is at work. But as we've already said, when we hear of the work of Jesus, we can see God's character at work. So we can see and we can say quite happily that the party has begun, whether or not others are willing to see it or accept it. So as we seek to live with this real God, who is seeking justice through compassion and grace, slowness to anger in love and faithfulness, what will we do? Will we join the party wherever we find God at work? Or will we wait for God to work as we expect him to? For as Hebrews 13:8 reminds us, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. I am sure he will continue to serve the Father wherever he is called, to whomever he is called. My only question is, will we be so brave as to trust our God and join with him and celebrate too? For truly, we can rely on God's faithfulness.